England, 1829. The grand ballroom of Ashford House shimmered beneath the glow of 1,000 candles, their flames dancing in harmony with the rustle of silk gowns and the gentle strains of a waltz. Lady Rosemary Fairley stood at the periphery of the festivities, her gloved hands clasped tightly before her, her gaze fixed upon the swirling dancers, with an expression that might have been mistaken for contentment by those who did not know her well. But beneath the carefully composed mask she wore, her heart harbored a quiet resignation that had settled there like autumn frost upon a window pane. This would be her last ball. She had promised herself as much when she had fastened the clasps of her modest pearl necklace that evening, when she had allowed her lady's maid to arrange her chestnut hair in a simple style that befitted a woman of her age and station. At 27, she had long since ceased to be a debutante, long since abandoned the hopes and dreams that had once filled her girlish heart. The whispers that followed her through drawing rooms and garden parties had grown too loud to ignore, the pitying glances too sharp to bear. Poor Lady Rosemary, they would say, their voices carrying just loudly enough for her to hear. Still unmarried at her age, one wonders what deficiency of character must account for such a circumstance. The words had accumulated over 7 long seasons, each utterance another small wound that never quite healed. She had learned to hold her head high, to smile politely even as the barbs found their mark, but the cumulative effect had taken its toll. Where once she had entered ballrooms with tentative hope, now she entered them with the weary acceptance of a soldier marching into inevitable defeat. Her younger sister, Lydia, had married a respectable viscount 3 seasons past, and now resided in Hampshire with 2 small children and a third expected before winter's end. The comparison between them was inevitable and cruel. Where Lydia possessed golden curls and a vivacious manner that drew admirers like bees to honeysuckle, Rosemary had inherited their father's more serious countenance and their mother's propensity for intellectual pursuits. She read voraciously, spoke her mind with unfortunate frequency, and possessed neither the simpering charm nor the calculated coquetry that seemed to be required of young ladies in search of husbands. Not once in 7 seasons had she received an invitation to a private tea. Not once had a gentleman called upon her with flowers or poetry. The slights had accumulated like stones in her pockets, weighing her down until she could scarcely remember what it felt like to hope. She had watched as girls younger than herself, girls with half her intelligence and accomplishments, were courted and married with seemingly effortless grace. She had stood as bridesmaid at countless weddings, smiling until her cheeks ached while her heart slowly turned to lead. And so she had retreated into her books, into the pages of novels where heroines with independent spirits were rewarded with passionate devotion, where love arrived unexpectedly and transformed everything it touched. In those fictional worlds, women like her, women who thought too much and felt too deeply, were not objects of ridicule, but of admiration. She knew it was foolish to seek solace in such fantasies, yet she could not help herself. The books were her companions when loneliness threatened to overwhelm her, her escape when the weight of societal judgment grew too heavy to bear. In her room at home, she had amassed a collection of novels that would have scandalized the matrons of the ton had they known of it. She read by candlelight long into the night, losing herself in tales of star-crossed lovers and passionate declarations. She wept over tragic endings and rejoiced at happy ones, living vicariously through characters who experienced the romance that had been denied to her in reality. Her favorite heroines were those who defied convention, who spoke their minds and refused to be diminished by society's narrow expectations. In them, she saw reflections of herself, or at least of the woman she might have been in a more forgiving world. Tonight, she told herself, she would observe the pageantry one final time. She would commit to memory the glittering spectacle of the ton at its most magnificent, and then she would withdraw from society altogether. Her mother would protest, of course, but Rosemary had already prepared her arguments. She would devote herself to charitable works, to the management of the household, to the care of her aging parents. It would be a quiet life, perhaps, but it would be hers, free from the humiliation of being perpetually overlooked. She was so lost in these melancholy reflections that she did not immediately notice when the murmur of conversation in the ballroom shifted, when heads began to turn toward the entrance with expressions of surprise and interest. It was only when her friend, Miss Prudence Ashworth, appeared at her elbow with flushed cheeks and bright eyes that Rosemary emerged from her reverie. "Rosemary, you shall never guess who has just arrived," Prudence whispered urgently, her fan fluttering with agitation. "The Duke of Thornbury himself, can you imagine? Everyone thought he would remain in Yorkshire for the entire season, yet here he is, and looking quite formidable, I must say." Rosemary followed her friend's gaze to where a tall figure stood near the entrance, surveying the assembly with an air of cool detachment. Even from a distance, the Duke of Thornbury commanded attention. He was a man of perhaps 35, with dark hair that fell in waves across his forehead, and features that were aristocratic in their severity. His evening clothes were impeccably tailored, his bearing that of a man accustomed to deference and respect. There was something in the set of his shoulders, in the way he held himself apart from the crowd, that suggested a soul as solitary as her own. "I wonder what brings him to London," Prudence continued, her voice alive with speculation. "They say he has not attended a ball in 3 years, not since his wife passed. Poor man, to lose her so young, and in childbed no less. One can hardly imagine the grief he must have endured." Rosemary felt a pang of sympathy for the Duke, even as she told herself it was absurd to feel anything for a man she had never met, a man who moved in circles far above her own. The Duke of Thornbury was one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in England, possessed of vast estates and considerable political influence. He would have no reason to notice someone like her, no cause to acknowledge her existence. And yet, as if drawn by some invisible thread, the Duke's gaze swept across the ballroom and came to rest upon her. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, their eyes met, and Rosemary felt a shock of recognition that defied all logic. It was as though he saw past the plain gown and the unfashionable hairstyle, past the armor of resignation she had so carefully constructed, to something essential and true that lay beneath. The intensity of his gaze left her breathless. She had been looked at before, of course, with pity, with disdain, with casual dismissal, but never like this. Never with such focused attention, as though she were the only person in the crowded ballroom worthy of notice. Her heart began to beat an erratic rhythm against her ribs, and she felt heat rise to her cheeks, despite her best efforts at composure. Then the moment passed. The Duke inclined his head in the barest suggestion of acknowledgement, before turning to greet his host, and Rosemary was left wondering if she had imagined the entire exchange. Perhaps it had been merely a trick of the candlelight, a projection of her own desperate longing onto an indifferent stranger. "Did you see that?" Prudence breathed, her eyes wide with astonishment. "He looked directly at you, Rosemary, I swear it upon my honor. And not just a passing glance, he truly looked at you, as though committing your face to memory." "You are mistaken," Rosemary replied firmly, though her heart had begun to beat with an unfamiliar rhythm. "The Duke was merely scanning the room. There is no reason he should take particular notice of me." But even as she spoke the words, she found herself unable to look away from where the Duke stood in conversation with Lord Ashford. There was an intensity to his presence that both unsettled and intrigued her, a sense that beneath his controlled exterior lay depth she could scarcely fathom. She watched as he moved through the crowd, noting how people parted before him like waves before the prow of a ship, how they sought his attention with barely concealed eagerness. He was courteous to all, yet distant, as though some part of him remained forever separate from the glittering world around him. The evening proceeded much as all such evenings did. Rosemary declined several invitations to dance from elderly widowers and younger sons, seeking to ingratiate themselves with her father, preferring to remain in her position of observation. She watched as debutantes giggled and flirted, as matrons gossiped behind their fans, as the complex social machinery of the ton turned with its usual precision. She catalogued each familiar face, each predictable interaction, telling herself that she would not miss any of it. Near the refreshment table, she overheard a group of young ladies discussing the Duke in hushed, excited tones. "He is even more handsome than I remembered," one of them sighed. "And so tragically romantic, mourning his wife all these years. Do you suppose he might be ready to marry again?" "My mother says he must," another replied. "He needs an heir after all." But who could possibly compare to the late Duchess? They say she was a paragon of virtue and beauty, accomplished in every art. I cannot imagine any of us measuring up to such a standard." Rosemary turned away from the conversation, feeling the familiar ache of inadequacy settle over her like a shroud. If the Duke were indeed seeking a new wife, he would have his choice of the season's most accomplished debutantes. Beautiful, young, perfectly trained in all the feminine arts, they would line up for the privilege of becoming his Duchess. What use would he have for a 27-year-old spinster whose chief accomplishments were reading Greek philosophy and expressing opinions that made her elders uncomfortable? It was nearly midnight when she decided to seek refuge in the library, a room she knew Lord Ashford kept well stocked for guests who shared her bookish inclinations. She slipped away from the ballroom unnoticed, grateful for the relative quiet of the corridor beyond. The sounds of music and laughter faded as she walked, replaced by the gentle tick of a long-case clock and the whisper of her skirts against the marble floor. The library, when she reached it, was blessedly empty, lit only by the glow of a dying fire in the hearth. She moved toward the shelves with a sense of homecoming, running her fingers along the leather spines until she found a volume of poetry that she had read before and loved. Lord Byron, whose scandalous personal life had made him both celebrated and reviled, but whose words spoke to something wild and unfettered in her own soul. She had just settled into a chair by the fire, the book open in her lap, when the door opened behind her. Expecting to see a servant or perhaps another refugee from the festivities, she looked up with a polite smile that froze upon her lips when she saw who stood in the doorway. The Duke of Thornbury regarded her with an expression she could not decipher, his dark eyes thoughtful in the firelight. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions and possibilities. Rosemary's mind raced, searching for something appropriate to say, some explanation for her presence in what was, after all, a private room far from the supervised safety of the ballroom. Then, with a grace that belied his considerable height, the Duke stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. The click of the latch seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet space, and Rosemary felt her breath catch in her throat. This was improper, scandalously so. If they were discovered alone together, her reputation, such as it was, would be utterly destroyed. "Forgive me," the Duke said, his voice a rich baritone that seemed to resonate in her very bones. "I did not mean to intrude upon your solitude. I came in search of escape, and found instead what I did not know I was seeking." Rosemary felt heat rise to her cheeks at the cryptic remark. She rose from her chair with as much dignity as she could muster, clutching the book before her like a shield. "Your Grace, I should return to the ballroom. It would not be proper for us to be alone together. And yet propriety has never been your master, has it, Lady Rosemary?" The Duke moved closer, his gaze never leaving her face. "I have been making inquiries about you this evening. I am told you prefer books to dancing, solitude to society, and truth to flattery. I am told you are considered unmarriageable by the standards of the ton, too old and too odd to attract a suitable husband." The words struck her like physical blows, all the more painful for being true. She lifted her chin, prepared to defend herself, prepared to flee if necessary. But the Duke continued before she could speak. "I am also told," he said quietly, moving another step closer, "that you possess one of the finest minds of your generation, that you read Latin and Greek with fluency, that you engage in correspondence with scholars at Cambridge on matters of philosophy and natural science. I am told that you volunteer at hospitals and orphanages, that you are generous to your father's tenants, that children and animals trust you instinctively. In short, Lady Rosemary, I am told that you are everything the world claims to value and yet consistently fails to recognize." Rosemary stared at him, unable to formulate a response. The Duke's praise seemed so incongruous with everything she had come to believe about herself that she could not accept it as genuine. Surely this was some elaborate jest, some cruel game designed to humiliate her further. And yet there was no mockery in his expression, no hint of insincerity in his steady gaze. "Why do you say such things?" she managed at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "We have never been introduced. You know nothing of me beyond idle gossip." "On the contrary," the Duke replied, "I know a great deal about you. I have known of your existence for some time, though we have not met formally. My late wife spoke of you with great admiration. You corresponded with her on matters of literature during the year before her death. She considered you a kindred spirit. The revelation left Rosemary momentarily breathless. She had to steady herself against the back of the chair, her legs suddenly unsteady beneath her. She remembered the correspondence well, the exchange of letters with a woman she had known only as C.H., and who had shared her passion for poetry and philosophy. Those letters had been a beacon of light during one of the darkest periods of her life, when the weight of social rejection had threatened to crush her entirely. She had poured her heart into those missives, expressing thoughts and feelings she could share with no one else, secure in the anonymity of the exchange. "I did not know," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She never revealed her identity, and I never thought to ask. Her insights were so profound, her understanding so deep. I treasured every letter. When they ceased coming, She trailed off, unable to continue. "When they ceased coming, you mourned," the Duke finished softly. "As did I. Caroline spoke of you often in those final weeks. She said that your letters brought her more comfort than any medicine, that your words reminded her there was beauty and truth in the world, even as her own world was ending. Before she died, when the pain grew too great for her to write, she would have your letters read to her. They eased her suffering in ways I could not." Tears spilled down Rosemary's cheeks before she could stop them. She had wept for her anonymous correspondent when the letters stopped, had felt the loss keenly even though she had never known the woman's true identity. To learn now that she had been a duchess, that she had brought comfort to someone in their final days, was almost more than she could bear. "Before she passed," the Duke continued, his own voice rough with emotion, "she extracted a promise from me. She made me swear that I would find you, that I would seek to know you as she had come to know you through your words. She said—" He paused, seeming to gather himself. "She said that you would understand me in ways no one else could, that you would see past the title and the fortune to the man beneath. She believed we were alike, you and I, two souls who felt too deeply in a world that prized shallow charm above genuine feeling. And is that why you are here?" Rosemary asked, her voice trembling. "To fulfill a dying woman's wish?" "I am here," the Duke said, closing the remaining distance between them, "because I read your letters myself after Caroline's death. I read them seeking to understand what had brought her such joy, and I found in them a voice that spoke to something long dormant in my own soul. Your words were like water to a man dying of thirst, Lady Rosemary. They reminded me that there were still people in the world capable of genuine thought and feeling, that not everyone had been reduced to automatons playing out society's prescribed roles." He reached out slowly, giving her time to move away if she wished, and gently wiped the tears from her cheeks with his handkerchief. The gesture was so tender, so unexpected, that it nearly undid her completely. "I am here," he continued, "because for 3 years I have thought of you. I have imagined what it would be like to speak with you face to face, to engage in the kind of conversation that feeds the soul rather than merely filling the silence. I am here because I wish to know if the woman who wrote those letters is as remarkable as her words suggest." The declaration hung in the air between them, impossible and terrifying in its implications. Rosemary wanted to flee, to dismiss his words as the product of grief-induced fancy, but something in the Duke's steady gaze held her rooted to the spot. She saw vulnerability there, beneath the aristocratic bearing and formal manner. She saw loneliness that matched her own, a hunger for connection that had gone long unfed. "You cannot mean this," she said desperately, even as hope began to unfurl in her chest like the first green shoots of spring. "You are a duke. You could have your pick of any young lady in England. Why would you fix your interest upon me?" "Because I am weary of simpering girls who can speak only of fashion and gossip," the Duke replied with startling vehemence. "Because I am tired of empty conversation and meaningless pleasantries. Because I want a wife who can challenge me intellectually, who can be a true partner in all things, not merely an ornament to grace my dinner table. Because, Lady Rosemary, I believe you might be that woman, if you can find it in yourself to trust me." Before she could respond, before she could even begin to process what he was saying, a loud voice echoed from the hallway beyond. "Rosemary, are you in there? Your mother is looking for you." The spell was broken. The Duke stepped back immediately, his expression once more assuming the cool detachment she had observed earlier. But his eyes remained warm, and there was a promise in them that made her heart race. "We shall continue this conversation another time," he said. "With your permission, I should like to call upon you tomorrow afternoon. Will you receive me?" Yes," Rosemary stammered, her thoughts in complete disarray. "Yes, that would be acceptable." The Duke bowed formally, and then he was gone, slipping from the library through a side door she had not noticed, with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to navigating social situations with discretion. Moments later, Prudence burst through the main door, her face alight with curiosity. "There you are. Whatever are you doing hiding in here? You look positively flushed. Are you feeling quite well?" "Perfectly well," Rosemary lied, pressing her cool hands to her burning cheeks. "I merely needed a moment of quiet." The heat of the ballroom was rather overwhelming. "Well, you've missed all the excitement," Prudence said, linking her arm through Rosemary's. "The Duke left shortly after you disappeared, which has set all the matchmaking mamas into fits of speculation. Some think he was taken ill, others believe he received urgent news from his estate, but Lady Worthington swears she saw him heading toward the library wing, which has caused no end of gossip." Rosemary's stomach dropped. "What sort of gossip?" "Oh, nothing too scandalous," Prudence assured her, though her eyes sparkled with barely suppressed curiosity. "Merely speculation about whether he might have arranged a private meeting with some fortunate lady. But no one can determine who it might have been, since you were the only person unaccounted for, and everyone knows the Duke would never—" She trailed off, her eyes widening as she studied Rosemary's face more closely. "Rosemary, you didn't. Tell me you didn't encounter the Duke alone." "It was entirely innocent," Rosemary said quickly, though her flaming cheeks belied her words. "He merely entered the library while I was reading. We exchanged a few words, nothing more." "A few words," Prudence repeated skeptically. "Is that what has you looking as though you've seen a vision? My dear friend, I have known you since we were children, and I have never seen such an expression on your face. What did he say to you?" But Rosemary could not bring herself to repeat the Duke's words, not even to her closest friend. They were too precious, too fragile, and she feared that speaking them aloud would somehow make them less real. "He merely expressed an interest in calling upon me," she said at last. "That is all." Prudence looked as though she wanted to press for more details, but they had reached the ballroom, and Lady Fairley was bearing down upon them with a determined expression. "Rosemary, there you are. Where have you been? I have been looking everywhere for you. Lord Wetherby wished to speak with you, and it was most embarrassing not to be able to produce you." "I needed some air, Mamma," Rosemary replied. The ballroom was rather warm. "Well, you've missed your opportunity now. Lord Wetherby has already departed." Lady Fairley's tone suggested this was a catastrophe of epic proportions, though Rosemary could muster little regret. Lord Wetherby was a widower of 60, with 5 grown children, and a habit of expounding at length on the management of his extensive vineyards. The prospect of an evening spent listening to him discoursing on grape cultivation held limited appeal. "I am sorry, Mamma," she said dutifully, though her mind was elsewhere entirely. Tomorrow. The Duke would call tomorrow. The thought sent equal measures of excitement and terror coursing through her veins. She did not sleep that night. Instead, she lay awake in her bed, watching the moonlight trace patterns across her ceiling, alternating between wild optimism and crushing doubt. Perhaps the Duke had been sincere. Perhaps he truly did see value in the qualities that others dismissed as eccentricities. But perhaps, too, he was simply a lonely man seeking to assuage his grief by pursuing an imagined connection to his late wife. Perhaps he would come tomorrow and realize in the cold light of day that his interest had been nothing more than a momentary aberration. She rose before dawn, unable to remain in bed any longer, and went to her writing desk. There, in a locked drawer, she kept the letters from C.H., the late Duchess Caroline. She had read them so many times that she could recite passages from memory, but she pulled them out now and read them again, searching for some clue she might have missed. The letters revealed a woman of extraordinary depth and sensitivity, someone who grappled with profound questions about the nature of existence, the meaning of suffering, the possibility of finding beauty and purpose even in the face of mortality. She had written about her illness with unflinching honesty, describing the physical pain but also the strange clarity it brought, the way it stripped away all pretense and left only what was essential. "I find myself thinking often about what truly matters," she had written in one of her final letters. "Not wealth or position or the good opinion of society, but connection, the meeting of minds and hearts, the knowledge that one has been truly seen and understood by another human soul. I have been blessed with such connection in my marriage, and I count it the greatest fortune of my life. But I fear for Alistair after I am gone. He is not a man who reveals himself easily, and I worry he will retreat into solitude rather than risk the vulnerability that true intimacy requires. If you knew him, my dear friend, I believe you would understand him as few others can. You share his depth of feeling, his hunger for meaning in a shallow world. I wish I could bring the two of you together, though I know such a thing is impossible. Still, I shall die hoping that somehow, someday, he might find in another what he found in me." Rosemary set down the letter with shaking hands. Caroline had known. Somehow, even before her death, she had known that Alistair would seek out Rosemary, that she would leave instructions for him to do so. It was almost as though she had been matchmaking from beyond the grave, orchestrating a connection between two lonely souls who might otherwise never have met. The thought should have been unsettling, but instead Rosemary found it strangely comforting. Caroline had loved her husband deeply, and her final act of love had been to ensure his future happiness. There was something beautiful in that, something that spoke to a generosity of spirit that Rosemary could only hope to emulate. By morning, she had convinced herself alternately that the entire encounter had been a dream, that the Duke would not call as promised, and that she would return to her quiet existence unchanged. But at precisely 3 o'clock that afternoon, the butler announced that His Grace, the Duke of Thornbury, had arrived and requested an audience with Lady Rosemary. Her mother, Lady Fairley, nearly dropped her teacup in shock. "The Duke of Thornbury, here. Whatever can he want? Rosemary, did you speak to him at the ball last evening?" "Briefly," Rosemary admitted, smoothing her skirts with trembling hands. "He mentioned that his late wife and I had corresponded. I believe he merely wishes to discuss her memory." It was a plausible explanation, and her mother accepted it without question, though she insisted on being present for the visit, as propriety demanded. She also insisted on sending a maid to ensure Rosemary's appearance was beyond reproach, fussing over every detail of her dress and hair, until Rosemary wanted to scream with frustration. When the Duke was finally shown into the drawing room, he greeted Lady Fairley with impeccable courtesy, before turning his attention to Rosemary. The intensity of his gaze was the same as it had been the previous night, and she felt her pulse quicken in response. "Lady Rosemary," he said, his voice formal but his eyes warm, "I trust you are well this afternoon?" "Very well, Your Grace," she replied, conscious of her mother's keen gaze upon them both. "And you?" "All the better for seeing you again," he said, and though the words were perfectly proper, there was an undertone to them that made her mother's eyebrows rise slightly. The visit proceeded with all the correctness that society required. They spoke of innocuous topics, the weather, which had been uncommonly fine for November, the quality of the roads between London and Yorkshire, mutual acquaintances who might be known to them both. The Duke mentioned his late wife only once, noting how much Caroline had valued her friendship with Lady Rosemary, and Rosemary responded with appropriate expressions of sympathy and respect. To any observer, it would have seemed a perfectly ordinary call, nothing more than a gesture of courtesy, from a grieving widower to a woman his wife had admired. But beneath the surface of polite conversation, Rosemary was acutely aware of the Duke's intense focus upon her, the way he listened to her words, as though they held significance beyond their mundane content. When she mentioned a book she was reading, a new translation of Plato's Republic, he immediately seized upon the topic, drawing her into a discussion of Enlightenment philosophy that ranged far beyond what would typically interest a gentleman making a social call. Her mother, bored by the intellectual turn of the conversation and satisfied that nothing improper was occurring, excused herself after half an hour to attend to household matters, leaving them alone, save for the presence of a maid stationed discreetly in the corner of the room. The moment Lady Fairley departed, The Duke's formal manner eased slightly. "I apologize if I overwhelmed you last night," he said quietly. "I fear I was more forward than I should have been. It is only that, having decided upon a course of action, I am unaccustomed to dissembling or proceeding with excessive caution." "I confess I hardly know what to think," Rosemary admitted. "Your words took me entirely by surprise. I am not the sort of woman who typically attracts the attention of gentlemen, much less a duke." "Then perhaps," the Duke suggested, leaning forward slightly, "you have simply not encountered the right gentleman, one who values substance over superficiality, depth over decoration." "But you know nothing of me," Rosemary protested, though her heart was pounding so hard she feared he must hear it. "A few letters written years ago cannot possibly provide sufficient basis for the interest you profess." "Those letters," the Duke said, his voice intense, "revealed more of your character than 100 superficial social interactions ever could. I know that you think deeply about moral philosophy, that you grapple with questions about the nature of justice and the foundations of human happiness. I know that you find solace in beauty, in poetry and music and the natural world. I know that you possess a compassionate heart, that you feel the suffering of others acutely and are moved to action by it. I know that you value honesty above flattery, truth above comfort." He paused, his eyes searching her face. "But you are right that letters alone are insufficient. That is why I am here. Allow me to know you better. Grant me the opportunity to call upon you regularly, to engage in conversation, to discover whether the connection I feel has genuine foundation. I ask nothing more than that at present." It was a reasonable request, and yet Rosemary found herself hesitating. To accept would be to open herself to hope, and hope, she had learned through bitter experience, was a dangerous thing. It made one vulnerable to disappointment, to pain. It was safer to expect nothing, to protect oneself behind walls of resignation and acceptance. And yet, looking into the Duke's earnest face, seeing the vulnerability beneath his aristocratic bearing, she found she could not bring herself to refuse. Perhaps she was being foolish, perhaps this would end in heartbreak. But for the first time in years, someone was looking at her with genuine interest, seeing value in the very qualities that had made her unmarriageable in the eyes of the ton. How could she turn away from that, even if it led to pain? "Very well," she said softly, her decision made. "You may call upon me, and we shall see what comes of it." The Duke's smile transformed his features, softening the austere lines and revealing a warmth she had not expected. For a moment she glimpsed the man beneath the title, the lonely soul who had spent 3 years in mourning, and was now cautiously emerging into the light once more. "You have made me very happy, Lady Rosemary," he said. "I shall endeavour not to abuse the privilege you have granted me." He rose to take his leave, but before departing he paused and looked back at her with an expression of such tenderness that it stole her breath. "I should warn you," he said, "that my courtship, should you permit it to become such, will attract considerable attention. There will be gossip and speculation, most of it unkind. Society will question my judgment and your worthiness. If you find the scrutiny too burdensome, you have only to say the word and I shall withdraw. I would not subject you to cruelty on my account." "I have endured gossip before, Your Grace," Rosemary replied with more confidence than she felt. "I believe I can withstand whatever society chooses to say about me." "I believe you can too," the Duke said quietly. "Caroline was right about you. You are far stronger than you know." Over the following weeks, the Duke proved true to his word. He called upon Rosemary with a regularity that set the neighborhood abuzz with speculation. Every Tuesday and Friday afternoon, precisely at 3 o'clock, his carriage would arrive at the Fairley residence, and he would spend 2 hours in conversation with Rosemary, always properly chaperoned, but increasingly intimate in their exchanges. They discovered a remarkable compatibility of mind and temperament. Their discussions ranged across philosophy, literature, politics, and natural science. The Duke had travelled extensively on the continent in his youth, and entertained her with stories of his adventures in Italy and Greece. Rosemary, who had never travelled beyond England's shores, listened with rapt attention, asking questions that revealed her keen intelligence and insatiable curiosity. But it was not only intellectual compatibility they discovered. The Duke had a dry wit that delighted her, a habit of making quietly ironic observations about the absurdities of social convention that made her laugh in ways she had not laughed in years. And there was a tenderness in his manner toward her, a protective quality that made her feel cherished in a way she had never experienced before. He began to take her on outings, always properly chaperoned, always observing the proprieties, but ventures nonetheless into the world beyond drawing rooms and morning calls. They went riding in Hyde Park, where he proved to be an excellent horseman, and she discovered that she had not entirely lost the skills she had developed in her youth. They attended exhibitions at the Royal Academy, standing before paintings and discussing composition and technique with an enthusiasm that drew curious glances from other visitors. They went to lectures at the Royal Society, where Rosmar's questions to the speakers revealed a scientific literacy that astonished many of the gentlemen present. With each meeting, Rosmar found her initial skepticism eroding, replaced by a growing admiration for the Duke's intelligence, his unexpected capacity for tenderness, and the way he seemed to truly see her, not as a deficient spinster or an embarrassing remnant of past seasons, but as a person of value and interest in her own right. He was, she discovered, a man of many contradictions. In public, he maintained the formal demeanor expected of his rank, but in private conversation, he revealed a warmth and vulnerability that few were privileged to witness. He spoke candidly of his loneliness after Caroline's death, of the emptiness that had pervaded his existence despite his wealth and position. He confessed that he had thrown himself into the management of his estates and his duties in Parliament as a means of avoiding the painful silence of his own thoughts. "I became a ghost, haunting my own life," Alistair told her one afternoon as they walked through the gardens of her family's townhouse, the late autumn sun casting long shadows across the gravel paths. "I performed all the functions expected of me with mechanical precision, but there was no joy in any of it, no sense of purpose beyond mere survival. And then I read your letters, and something awakened in me that I had thought dead and buried with Caroline." Rosmer felt tears prick at her eyes at the raw honesty in his voice. "I understand that feeling more than you might imagine, Your Grace. I too have been merely existing, rather than truly living. Each season that passed took a little more of my spirit until I feared there would be nothing left but an empty shell going through the motions of propriety." He stopped walking and turned to face her, taking her hand in his with a gentleness that made her heart ache. "Then let us promise each other that we shall not merely exist any longer. Let us dare to hope, to feel, to risk the pain that comes with genuine connection. Life is too brief and too precious to spend it in self-imposed exile from all that makes it worth living." It was in that moment, standing in the fading light of a November afternoon, that Rosmer allowed herself to believe that perhaps, against all odds and expectations, she might find the happiness that had eluded her for so long. The Duke's courtship was unlike anything she had imagined in her most fanciful reading. There were no grand romantic gestures or flowery declarations, but rather a steady, deliberate building of trust and understanding. He asked about her thoughts, her dreams, her opinions on matters both trivial and profound. He listened with genuine interest when she spoke, never dismissing her ideas as the fanciful notions of a woman who did not understand the complexities of the world. Yet as their connection deepened, complications arose that Rosmer had not anticipated. Her aunt, Lady Beatrice Hartwell, arrived in London with her daughter, Miss Arabella Hartwell, a young woman of 22, possessed of striking beauty and all the conventional accomplishments that Rosmer lacked. Lady Beatrice had heard rumours of the Duke's attentions to her niece and was determined to redirect his interest toward her own daughter. The campaign began with seemingly innocent visits, during which Lady Beatrice would invariably arrange to call precisely when she knew the Duke was expected. She would bring Arabella, dressed in the finest muslins and silks, her golden curls arranged in the latest fashion, her demeanour perfectly calculated to display youth, beauty and feminine charm. Arabella would play the pianoforte with accomplished skill, sing in a clear soprano voice, and engage in light, pleasant conversation that never ventured into topics that might be considered too serious or intellectual for a young lady. "My dear Rosmer," Lady Beatrice would say with false sweetness, "it is so kind of you to entertain His Grace, but surely you must grow weary of such constant attention. Why, at your age, you should be focusing on more suitable pursuits. Perhaps you might consider retiring to the countryside, where you could be of use to your aging parents. Arabella, darling, do show the Duke that watercolor you completed of the Lake District. She has such a delicate hand with landscapes." Alistair bore these intrusions with remarkable patience, responding to Arabella's performances with polite appreciation, while never allowing his attention to stray from Rosemary for more than a moment. But Rosemary could not help but make the inevitable comparisons. Arabella was everything she was not: young, beautiful, accomplished in all the feminine arts that society valued. When Arabella sang, her voice was like a nightingale's. When Rosemary attempted to sing, she could barely carry a tune. When Arabella played the pianoforte, her fingers danced across the keys with effortless grace. Rosemary had long since abandoned the instrument, finding her talents lay elsewhere. When Arabella conversed, she was charming and agreeable, never expressing an opinion that might challenge or disturb. Rosemary had never mastered the art of saying nothing with pleasant words. One particularly trying afternoon, after Lady Beatrice and Arabella had departed, following an extended visit during which they had monopolized much of the conversation, Rosemary found herself unable to maintain her composure any longer. Alistair had stayed behind, sensing her distress, and they sat together in the drawing-room as dusk gathered outside the windows. "You must see how ridiculous this is," Rosemary said, her voice tight with emotion she could no longer contain. "Lady Beatrice is right, though her motives are transparent. Arabella is young and beautiful, accomplished in every way that matters to society. She would make you a far more suitable duchess than I ever could. She could grace your ballrooms and entertain your guests with charm and elegance. She could give you airs without the concerns that come with a woman of my advanced years. Why persist in this courtship when you could have someone so much more appropriate?" Alistair's expression darkened with an emotion she had never seen in him before. Not anger, precisely, but something akin to fierce determination. He rose from his chair and moved to kneel before her, taking both her hands in his with an urgency that startled her. "Do you truly believe," he said, his voice low and intense, "that I have spent 3 years in mourning, 3 years reading and rereading your letters, 3 years imagining what it would be like to meet the woman whose words spoke to my soul, only to be swayed by a pretty face and an ability to play the pianoforte? Do you think so little of me or of yourself that you cannot conceive I might value substance over superficiality?" "I think," Rosemary said, tears spilling down her cheeks, "that I am terrified. I am terrified that this is all some beautiful dream from which I shall awaken to find myself alone once more. I am terrified that you will come to your senses and realize what everyone else already knows, that I am too old, too plain, too peculiar to be the wife of a duke. I am terrified that Lady Beatrice speaks the truth when she says I am making a fool of myself by accepting your attentions." "Then let me tell you what I see when I look at you," Alistair said, reaching up to gently wipe the tears from her face. "I see a woman of extraordinary intelligence and depth of character. I see someone who has endured years of unkindness and rejection without allowing it to embitter her heart or diminish her capacity for compassion. I see the woman whose letters reminded me what it meant to feel, to hope, to believe that connection between two souls was possible even in the midst of grief and loneliness. I see the only woman I have met since Caroline's death, who makes me want to fully rejoin the world of the living." He paused, his dark eyes searching her face with an intensity that took her breath away. "I see the woman I wish to marry, if she will have me. Not because Caroline wished it, though I am grateful for her wisdom in bringing us together. Not because I require a wife to fulfill societal expectations or produce an heir, though those considerations have their place, but because, Rosemary Fairley, I have come to love you. I love your brilliant mind and your generous heart. I love the way you challenge me intellectually and the way you make me laugh with your dry observations about the absurdities of the ton. I love your courage in remaining true to yourself, despite years of pressure to conform. I love you, and I wish to spend the remainder of my days proving to you that you are worthy of all the love and devotion I have to offer." The declaration hung in the air between them, more precious than any jewel, more binding than any vow. Rosemary stared at him through her tears, scarcely able to believe what she was hearing. The Duke of Thornbury, one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in England, was kneeling before her, declaring his love, asking her to be his wife. It was beyond anything she had dared to imagine, beyond the wildest flights of fancy in the romantic novels she had read to console herself during long, lonely nights. "I love you too," she whispered, the words emerging from some deep place within her that had been locked away for so long she had forgotten it existed. "I think I began to love you that first night in the library, when you looked at me as though I mattered, as though I were worth seeing. And with each conversation, each moment spent in your company, that love has grown until it fills every corner of my heart. But Alistair, are you certain? The Ton will speak cruelly of this match. They will say you have lost your wits, that grief has impaired your judgment. They will pity you and mock me." "Let them speak," Alistair said with quiet vehemence. "Let them say what they will. The opinion of society matters nothing to me compared to the prospect of a life lived with you by my side. Caroline taught me that true happiness comes not from meeting others' expectations, but from having the courage to follow one's heart, even when that path leads somewhere unexpected. She would be overjoyed to know that I had found love again, and with the woman she herself chose for me." He rose and drew her to her feet, still holding her hands in his. "Marry me, Rosemary, be my duchess, my partner, my companion in all things. Let us build a life together based not on what society demands, but on what our hearts require. Let us prove that there is more than one path to happiness, and that the unconventional choice can be the right one." "Yes," Rosemary said, her voice stronger now, filled with a certainty that surprised her. "Yes, I will marry you, Alistair Hawthorne. I will be your duchess and your wife, and I shall endeavour every day to be worthy of the love you have offered me." The kiss that followed was tender and sweet, a sealing of promises made and accepted. When they finally drew apart, Rosemary felt as though she had been transformed, as though the weight she had carried for so many years had been lifted, leaving her lighter and freer than she had ever been. The announcement of their engagement, when it came, caused precisely the scandal Alistair had predicted. The drawing rooms of London buzzed with gossip and speculation. How could the Duke of Thornbury, so recently emerged from mourning, choose to marry a woman 7 years past her prime, when he could have his pick of the season's most beautiful debutantes? What had Lady Rosemary Fairley done to ensnare him? Was it true that she had been corresponding with the late Duchess and had used that connection to worm her way into the Duke's affections? Lady Beatrice was particularly vocal in her disapproval, taking every opportunity to express her dismay at her niece's presumption. "It is most irregular," she proclaimed at Lady Worthington's afternoon tea, her voice pitched to carry across the room. "One can only assume that poor Arabella's youth and beauty intimidated Rosemary into acting with unseemly haste to secure the Duke's proposal before he came to his senses. Mark my words, the marriage will not be a happy one. How can it be, when founded on such an unequal match?" But for every voice raised in criticism, there were others who defended the match. Prudence Ashworth became Rosemary's most stalwart champion, declaring to anyone who would listen that her friend possessed more wit, wisdom, and genuine worth than all the season's simpering debutantes combined. Several older ladies who had known and admired the late Duchess Caroline spoke approvingly of the match, noting that Caroline herself had been a woman of intellectual bent and that it was fitting the Duke should choose a second wife who could engage him on that level. Most surprisingly, support came from an unexpected quarter. The Duke's mother, the Dowager Duchess of Thornbury, arrived in London expressly to meet her future daughter-in-law. She was a formidable woman in her 60s, possessed of the same penetrating intelligence that characterized her son, and Rosemary approached their first meeting with considerable trepidation. The Dowager Duchess received her in the morning room of Thornbury House, studying Rosemary with shrewd eyes that missed nothing. For a long moment she said nothing, merely observing, and Rosemary felt her old insecurities rising to the surface. Here was another person who would find her lacking, another voice to join the chorus of those who questioned the wisdom of Alistair's choice. Then the Dowager Duchess smiled, an expression that transformed her austere features, and revealed where her son had inherited his unexpected warmth. "You are precisely as Caroline described you in her letters to me," she said, her voice carrying the authority of one accustomed to command. "She wrote to me about you, you know, during those final months. She said she had found in her correspondence with you a kindred spirit, someone who understood the loneliness of being a woman of intelligence in a world that values beauty and compliance above all else. She told me that if Alistair ever found his way to you, I should welcome you as a daughter, for you would make him happy in ways that no conventional match ever could. Rosemary felt tears prick her eyes at the revelation. Caroline was extraordinarily kind to me, Your Grace, though I did not know her true identity at the time. Her letters were a source of great comfort during a difficult period of my life. And yours were a comfort to her in her final days, the Dowager Duchess replied. That alone would be sufficient reason for me to welcome you into this family. But I have observed my son these past weeks, and I have seen a change in him that I had despaired of ever witnessing. He is alive again, truly alive, in a way he has not been since Caroline's death. That is your doing, Lady Rosemary, and for that I am more grateful than I can express. She rose and came to take Rosemary's hands in hers, her grip firm and warm. You will face challenges in your new role. There will be those who question your suitability, who watch for any sign of weakness or inadequacy. But you must remember that being a duchess is not about conforming to others' expectations. It is about using your position to do good, to make a difference in the world, to be true to yourself while honoring the responsibilities that come with rank and privilege. I believe you have the strength and character to meet those challenges, and I promise you that you will have my full support. The Dowager Duchess's approval silenced many of the harshest critics, and gradually the tenor of the gossip began to shift. Instead of focusing on what made the match unsuitable, society began to speculate about the romance of it all. The grieving widower finding love again, the overlooked spinster discovering happiness at last. It became a story that appealed to romantic sensibilities, particularly after it became known that the late Duchess herself had fostered the connection between Rosemary and Alistair. The wedding took place on a cold December morning at the Duke's estate in Yorkshire. Rosemary had insisted on a private ceremony, attended only by immediate family and closest friends. She had endured enough public scrutiny during the engagement and wished for their actual wedding to be an intimate affair, focused on the promises they were making to each other rather than on spectacle and display. She wore a gown of ivory silk, simply cut but exquisitely made, with Brussels lace at the sleeves and neckline. Her mother had tried to convince her to wear something more elaborate, something that would make a grand statement, but Rosemary had remained firm. This was to be a celebration of genuine feeling, not a theatrical performance for society's entertainment. As she walked down the aisle of the small chapel on her father's estate, toward where Alistair waited at the altar, Rosemary felt a sense of rightness settle over her, like a benediction. This was where she was meant to be, with this man who had seen past all the barriers she had erected and found the woman beneath worthy of love. When Alistair took her hand and spoke his vows, his voice was steady and sure, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that left no room for doubt. I, Alistair Charles Hawthorne, take thee, Rosemary Elizabeth Fairley, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part. And when it was her turn, Rosemary spoke her own vows with a confidence she had never possessed before, her voice clear and unwavering. I, Rosemary Elizabeth Fairley, take thee, Alistair Charles Hawthorne, to be my wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part. The kiss that sealed their marriage was tender and full of promise, and when they turned to face their assembled guests as the Duke and Duchess of Thornbury, Rosemary felt as though she had finally come home. The wedding breakfast that followed was a joyous affair, filled with toasts and well-wishes. Even Lady Beatrice managed to offer congratulations, though her smile never quite reached her eyes. Arabella, to her credit, seemed genuinely happy for her cousin, perhaps relieved to no longer be thrust into competition for a man she had never truly wanted. But the moment Rosemary treasured most came later, when she and Alistair were finally alone in the carriage that would take them to Thornbury House for their wedding night. He took her hand in his and raised it to his lips, his eyes warm with love and gratitude. "Thank you," he said softly. for having the courage to believe in this in us, when every rational consideration argued against it. Thank you for seeing past my title and fortune to the man beneath. Thank you for agreeing to spend your life with me. I should be thanking you, Rosemary replied, her voice thick with emotion. You gave me back my life, Alistair. You made me believe that I was worthy of love, that my unconventional nature was not a deficiency, but a strength. You saw value in qualities that society dismissed, and in doing so, you transformed everything. Then let us agree to be grateful to each other, Alistair said with a smile, and to Caroline, whose love was generous enough to extend beyond her own life. She brought us together, but what we have built is ours alone. The months that followed their marriage were among the happiest of Rosemary's life. Alistair proved to be everything she had hoped for in a husband and more. He consulted her on estate matters, valued her opinions on political questions, and encouraged her intellectual pursuits in ways that would have scandalized conventional society. Together, they established a salon at Thornbury House, inviting scholars, writers, and thinkers for evenings of stimulating conversation and debate. Rosemary flourished in this environment, her natural intelligence and curiosity finally given free rein. But it was not all intellectual pursuits and serious discussion. Alistair had a playful side that emerged in their private moments, a capacity for joy and laughter that had been suppressed during his years of mourning. He would surprise her with small gifts, a rare book he had found, a particularly beautiful flower from the greenhouse, a silly caricature he had sketched of some pompous member of the ton. They took long walks through the grounds of his various estates, discussing everything and nothing, simply enjoying each other's company. Rosemary also discovered that she possessed a talent for the duties of a duchess that surprised even herself. While she would never be the sort to obsess over fashion or delight in vapid social calls, she found purpose in using her position to help others. She became actively involved in charitable work, particularly in education for poor children and support for women in difficult circumstances. The Dowager Duchess became her mentor and friend, teaching her how to navigate the complexities of aristocratic society while remaining true to her own values. One afternoon in early spring, nearly 6 months after their marriage, Rosemary sat in the library at Thornbury House, surrounded by correspondence related to a new school she was helping to establish for girls from impoverished families. Alistair entered and found her there, her brow furrowed in concentration as she reviewed budgets and curricula. He came to stand behind her chair, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. "You work too hard, my love. The correspondence can wait until tomorrow." "But I want to have everything prepared for the committee meeting next week," Rosemary protested, even as she leaned back into his touch. "If we can demonstrate that our approach is both practical and affordable, we shall have a much better chance of securing support from other members of the ton." "You shall convince them regardless," Alistair said with quiet confidence. "You have a gift for making people see what is possible, for inspiring them to be better than they imagined they could be. It is one of the many reasons I love you." Rosemary set down her pen and turned in her chair to look up at him. "Do you ever regret it, Alistair? Choosing me over someone younger, someone who could have given you an heir without difficulty, someone who would have been more conventional in her approach to being a duchess?" It was a question she had asked before, in various forms, and each time he answered with patience and love. "I have never once regretted marrying you, Rosemary. Not for a single moment. Yes, society expected me to choose differently, but their expectations mean nothing compared to my own happiness. And as for an heir," he paused, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth, "I have cousins aplenty who can inherit should we remain childless, but I confess I hope we shall not be. I should very much like to have a child with you, to watch you become a mother, to raise a son or daughter who inherits your intelligence and compassion, and your kindness and wisdom," Rosemary added softly. "Though I confess the prospect terrifies me, I am already past the age when such things come easily, and I fear—" "Fear accomplishes nothing," Alistair interrupted gently, kneeling beside her chair so their eyes were level. "We shall hope for the best and face whatever comes together, as we do all things. And if children are not to be part of our future, we shall still have a life rich in love and purpose. You are enough, Rosemary. You have always been enough." It was shortly after this conversation that Rosemary began to suspect she might be with child. She said nothing at first, fearing to raise hopes that might be disappointed, but as the weeks passed and the signs became unmistakable, she finally shared her news with Alistair. His joy was unrestrained, his concern for her well-being immediate and touching. He insisted she reduce her activities, though Rosemary refused to become an invalid, maintaining her charitable work and intellectual pursuits throughout her pregnancy. The birth, when it came in the depths of the following winter, was difficult, but ultimately successful. Rosemary was delivered of a healthy daughter with dark hair like her father's and eyes that promised to be as sharp and intelligent as her mother's. They named her Caroline Rose, in honor of the woman whose love and wisdom had brought them together. As Rosemary held her daughter for the first time, Alistair sitting beside her on the bed with his arm around her shoulders, she thought about how far she had come from that night at Ashford House, when she had believed she was attending her last ball. She had been so certain then that happiness was not meant for women like her, that she would spend her life as an object of pity and scorn. But Caroline had shown her another path, and Alistair had walked it with her. Together they had built a marriage based not on society's expectations, but on genuine love and mutual respect. They had proved that unconventional choices could lead to profound happiness, that there was more than one way to live a meaningful life. "What are you thinking?" Alistair asked softly, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I am thinking," Rosemary replied, her voice full of wonder, "that I am the luckiest woman in England. Not because I married a duke, though that has its advantages, but because I found a man who loves me not despite my unconventional nature, but because of it. Because I found someone who sees me truly and loves what he sees." "Then we are both lucky," Alistair said, gazing down at their daughter's sleeping face, "for I found the same in you." Years passed, and the story of the Duke of Thornbury and his unconventional Duchess became something of a legend among the ton. Rosemary never did become the sort of Duchess that society initially expected. She remained bookish and intellectual, more interested in establishing schools and supporting charitable causes than in hosting elaborate balls or setting fashion trends. But she earned the respect and eventually the admiration of many, including some who had initially been her harshest critics. Lady Beatrice eventually made peace with the match, particularly after her daughter Arabella married a wealthy merchant's son and discovered that love mattered more than title. Prudence Ashworth remained Rosemary's closest friend, delighting in her role as godmother to young Caroline Rose, and later to the son who followed 2 years after, a boy they named William Charles. The Dowager Duchess lived to see both her grandchildren born, pronouncing them perfect in every way, and declaring that Caroline had known exactly what she was doing when she brought Rosemary and Alistair together. She passed peacefully in her sleep when William was still an infant, secure in the knowledge that her son had found happiness again, and that the Thornbury line would continue. As for Rosemary and Alistair, their love only deepened with the passage of years. They remained each other's closest companions, best friends as well as lovers, partners in all things. They continued their salon, now famous throughout intellectual circles in London and beyond. They travelled together to the continent, finally allowing Rosemary to see the places she had only read about in books. They raised their children with love and wisdom, teaching them that true worth came not from title or wealth, but from character and compassion. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Alistair surprised Rosemary with a gift, a bound collection of all the letters she had exchanged with Caroline, carefully preserved and annotated. On the first page he had written an inscription in his own hand. "To my beloved Rosemary, these letters brought us together, but it is who you are, brilliant, compassionate, courageous, and true, that keeps me by your side. With all my love, always Alistair." Rosemary wept as she read those words, remembering the lonely, resigned woman she had been that night at Ashford House, the woman who had believed happiness was not meant for her. She thought of Caroline, whose generosity of spirit had reached beyond death to create this beautiful life. And she thought of all the young women who might still be where she had once been, believing themselves unworthy of love because they did not fit society's narrow definition of acceptability. "We should tell our story," she said to Alistair that evening, as they sat together in the library where they had first truly spoken. "Not for our own sake, but for others who might need to hear that there are many paths to happiness, that being different is not the same as being deficient. Then we shall tell it, Alistair agreed, taking her hand in his. Though I suspect many will not believe it. They will think it too improbable, too much like a romantic novel. Let them think what they will, Rosemary replied with a smile. Those who need to hear it will understand. Those who are alone and afraid, who have been told they are too old or too odd or too intellectual to be loved, they will know that happiness is possible even when it seems impossible. That sometimes the unconventional choice is the right one. That true love sees not what society values but what truly matters. And so they did tell their story, not through any formal publication, but through the lives they lived, through the example they set, through the many people they helped and inspired. The Duke and Duchess of Thornbury became known not just for their title and wealth, but for their genuine partnership, their intellectual pursuits, their charitable works, and their obvious love for one another. Young women who felt out of place in society's ballrooms would hear of Lady Rosemary and take courage. Men who had lost their wives would think of the Duke and dare to hope for love again. And gradually, slowly, the notion began to take hold that there might be more than one way to find happiness, more than one path to a fulfilling life. On a spring afternoon many years later, when Rosemary was a woman in her 50s and her children were grown with families of their own, she returned to Ashford House for a ball. She had not attended a ball in years, preferring quieter entertainments, but her goddaughter was being presented to society, and Prudence had begged her to come. As she stood once more at the periphery of the ballroom, watching the dancers swirl past in their elaborate gowns, she was approached by a young woman, perhaps 25 or 26, with an earnest expression and intelligent eyes. "Your Grace," the young woman said, curtsying nervously, "forgive my presumption, but I felt I must speak with you. I am Miss Elizabeth Pemberton, and I have heard your story. I too have spent years being told I am too old, too serious, too bookish to attract a husband. I have nearly resigned myself to spinsterhood as you once did, but your example has given me hope that perhaps there is still a chance for happiness, even for those of us who do not fit the expected mold." Rosemary smiled at the young woman, seeing in her something of her younger self. "My dear Miss Pemberton, the greatest wisdom I can offer you is this. Do not wait for someone else to validate your worth. You are valuable precisely as you are, with all your intelligence and seriousness and love of books. The right person will recognize that, as my husband recognized it in me. And if that person never comes, you can still build a meaningful life filled with purpose and joy. But never ever accept the judgment of those who cannot see your worth. Their blindness says nothing about you and everything about their own limitations." "Thank you, Your Grace," Miss Pemberton said, tears shining in her eyes. "You cannot know how much I needed to hear that." "Oh, but I can," Rosemary replied gently, "for I too once needed to hear it and no one was there to say it. That is why I say it now to you and to any other young woman who needs reminding that she is enough, exactly as she is." As Miss Pemberton moved away, Alistair appeared at Rosemary's side, as he had so many times over the years. He was older now, silver threading through his dark hair, but his eyes still held the same warmth and intelligence that had first captured her heart. "Still inspiring young women, I see," he said with a smile, offering her his arm. "You have done more good in this world than you realize, my love." "We have done it together," Rosemary corrected, taking his arm. "Everything worthwhile that I have accomplished has been with you by my side." "Then let us continue together," Alistair said, leading her toward the ballroom floor. "Dance with me, Duchess. Let us show them all that love endures, that happiness is possible, and that the unconventional choice can indeed be the right one." And as they moved together across the polished floor, surrounded by the glittering ton but seeing only each other, Rosemary thought once more of that young woman she had been, standing alone and resigned at the edge of the festivities, believing her story was over before it had truly begun. She thought of Caroline, whose letters had been a lifeline in dark times, and whose final act of love had been to bring two lonely souls together. And she thought of all the young women who might yet benefit from their example, who might find courage in their story, to believe that happiness was possible, even when it seemed impossibly far away. The music swelled, the candles flickered, and the Duke and Duchess of Thornbury danced on, their love a testament to the truth that the heart knows its own path, and that sometimes the greatest happiness comes from following that path, regardless of what society might say. In the end, theirs was not just a love story, but a story of courage, of choosing authenticity over conformity, of finding value in what truly matters, rather than what society dictates should matter. It was a story that deserved to be told and retold, for as long as there were those who needed to hear that they too were worthy of love, that their differences were not deficiencies, and that happiness could be found in the most unexpected places. And so the story of Lady Rosemary Fairley and the Duke of Thornbury lived on, passed from generation to generation, a reminder that love sees with different eyes than society, and that sometimes the greatest romance begins not with a first glance across a crowded ballroom, but with letters exchanged between kindred spirits, with words that speak to the soul, and with the courage to believe that one is worthy of being loved exactly as one is. Oisi, thank you for staying with us until the end of this emotional journey. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe, like, comment, and share our channel. Your support inspires us to keep creating more stories of love, redemption, and breathtaking twists. Help us reach our first 2,000 subscribers, and together we'll continue sharing tales that warm the heart. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another of our historical stories. Click and let yourself be enchanted by another unforgettable tale. With all our gratitude, Echoes of Romance.